"Grandma, can we sleep in the doghouse tonight?" That sentence came out in a trembling voice, right there in the rain-soaked yard. The sound of raindrops falling, the smell of wet earth. And under the little doghouse, Eve, 2 shivering kids and a coughing old dog were standing in front of me. For a moment, anger shot up in me. But strangely, from somewhere deep inside, a long-hidden loneliness slowly rose instead. I had endured, I had crumbled, and at least that night. I didn't want to pretend I hadn't seen them. Why those children ended up asking to sleep in a doghouse. And how my old age was turned upside down after that night, I'll tell you slowly from the beginning. You're listening to Silver Story Tree, where the voices of life's late chapters gently bloom again. Subscribe, like, and turn on the bell to hear more heartfelt stories that grow with time. I could hear the rain tapping on the doghouse roof. I was filling Buddy's bowl when one heard footsteps on the gravel driveway. The sound of wet stones crunching underfoot grew closer, and 2 small shadows stopped under the yard light. 2 kids in hoodies stood in front of the doghouse. One carried a backpack, the other held a leash attached to a tired-looking dog. When I set down Buddy's bowl and looked at them, the taller child spoke in a trembling voice. "Ma'am, can we sleep in the doghouse just for tonight?" My hand froze over the food bin. For a moment, I couldn't speak. "What is this, a motel?" I wanted to say. But then I noticed their dog sitting limply on the ground. There was a faint metallic clinking sound coming from inside the collar. But I didn't pay much attention to it then. The kids' sneakers were so worn their toes showed through. And their hoodies were soaked, weighing down their shoulders. I took a step forward. "Where do you 2 live? What are you doing showing up at someone's yard asking to sleep in a doghouse?" My voice came out gruff, but seeing their blue, frozen hands made me uneasy. The taller child answered, "Our uncle said we absolutely can't come home tonight." The smaller one bit their lip, glanced back at the dark street, and trembled. I looked toward my house. In the living room, my late husband's cowboy hat hung on the sofa. Armrest, and the old side table my daughter had left behind leaned in the corner. The single-story wood house wasn't large, but there was enough space to lay out blankets on the entryway floor. I sighed. "No doghouse. You can sleep inside the entryway, but you have to leave first thing tomorrow morning." The children nodded and followed me inside. I pulled 2 dry towels from the kitchen drawer and heated up instant soup in the microwave. As steam filled the kitchen, the kids grabbed their bowls and ate hungrily. The sound of spoons scraping the bottom was both cheerful and heartbreaking. Watching them, I remembered my younger days. The night I'd fled from a violent husband with my daughter in tow. It had been raining then too, and I'd climbed the stairs of a strange apartment building, clutching my daughter's hand. I could still hear my own trembling voice, asking someone to let us stay just one night. If that neighbor hadn't opened her door, where would I have ended up? After the children finished eating, I laid out 2 blankets on the entryway floor. The smaller child used the backpack as a pillow, and closed their eyes right away. The taller one pulled the dog close and whispered, "Thank you so much, ma'am." As I moved to close the door, I heard that metallic clinking from the dog collar again. The sound stuck in my ears strangely, like I was missing something important. I stood there for a long time without turning off the porch light, finally leaving just a small bulb on before heading to my bedroom. Even lying in bed, that sound kept coming back to me. The metallic clinking, the children's trembling voices asking about the doghouse, and the strange mix of kinship and injustice that pressed against my chest. That night, something in my heart opened just a little. At dawn, the sound of coffee brewing filled the house quietly. I watched the steam rise from the old pot, then glanced toward the entryway. The twins were curled up under the blankets. A worn backpack and an old dog leash seemed to be all they had. Walking to the living room with my coffee, I thought to myself, today I need to send them back to their uncle's house. But when I actually saw their faces, the words wouldn't come. The taller child opened their eyes and looked straight at me, speaking quietly. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We'll leave soon." The voice was small but firm. I asked them to give me their uncle's address, so I could call him to pick them up. That's when the taller child bit their lip and answered, "We don't have a home to go back to." With those few words, the kitchen air grew heavy. I set my coffee cup on the table and sat down in front of the child. The child slowly began to share their story. Their father had died in a car accident, and their mother passed away from illness the following year. After that, they'd bounced between their uncle's place and cheap motel rooms, eventually ending up sleeping in a car before getting kicked out. The smaller child just peeked out from under the blanket, listening quietly to their sibling. My mind felt tangled. How could adults do this to children who'd lost their parents? But at the same time, I remembered the cold texts from my daughter, Emily, who lived near Seattle. "Mom, take care of yourself. It's best to keep the house cleared out for later." I couldn't easily step forward, so I just gave them toast and milk for breakfast. Around lunchtime, I stopped by the small diner and grocery store in the town center. A new notice was posted on the bulletin board by the counter. Major Regional Redevelopment, Highway Expansion Plan. Looking at the map, I saw my neighborhood marked on it and felt unsettled. Daniel, the county social worker, came into the diner. He made his rounds asking the elderly folks how they were doing, then stopped at my table. "Grace, how are you these days? If you see any neglected teens or kids who need help, please let me know." He handed me his card with a smile, and I tucked it into my wallet. When I got home, the twins were playing in the yard with Buddy and their own dog. The smaller child clutched the dog leash tightly, watching me nervously before hiding behind their sibling. The taller child said, "We'll really leave soon, ma'am. We'll pack up." There was anxiety and guilt in that voice. I sighed and asked them to at least write down their uncle's phone number. The taller child started to pull out an old notebook from the backpack, then put it back and shook their head. "It's okay. We'll figure it out ourselves." I could tell they were hiding something, but I didn't press further. That night, I opened the drawer under my bedroom closet. Inside the old drawer my husband had left behind were a worn cassette tape and a few documents. I remembered what my husband used to say. "This house and land aren't just mine." I'd never fully understood those words, and after he passed, I'd simply forgotten about them. Anger and unease rose in me together over his leaving without explaining. Just before falling asleep, I heard the smaller child mumbling in their sleep from the living room. "Grandpa's land was supposed to be ours." My heart sank at those words. I pulled the blanket up and closed my eyes, but tossed and turned all night, unable to sleep. It felt like some important piece was slipping through my fingers. That night, doubt began to grow somewhere inside me. The next afternoon, I took the children on a walk along the dirt road. I could hear the late autumn wind rustling through the branches, and the smaller child fiddled with the dog leash, saying to their sibling, "This keeps rubbing weird. It feels like something's stuck." I stopped walking and looked closely at the leash in the child's hand. The buckle area looked slightly swollen. I suggested we carefully open the buckle, and the children watched me with tense expressions. When I pried the buckle open, a folded piece of paper and a small key dropped to the ground. When I unfolded the paper, a chill ran down my spine. In rough handwriting, it read, "This land is to be passed to my grandchildren Lily and Noah." Below that was my home address, a date, and a shaky signature. My husband's words echoed perfectly in my mind. Land held in trust for a debt. The grandpa's land the kids had mentioned. My hands trembled. The taller child's face went pale as they tried to snatch the paper back. "Our uncle said we can never show that to anyone. Please give it back." Fear mixed into their voice. The smaller child pressed close to their sibling, with tears in their eyes, watching me anxiously. Looking at the children's frightened faces, I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. I quietly slipped the paper and key into my apron pocket, and said, "This is important. I'll keep it safe." The children looked at each other uneasily, but my firm gaze kept them from saying more. Back home, I immediately went through my husband's drawer again. I found an old cassette recorder, and next to it, a tape labeled temporary wool-in marker. My hands shook as I pressed play. After some harsh static, my husband's voice came through. "Holding my brother-in-law's land in trust, someday. It has to be returned to the kids." His voice was young and steady, but carried weight. After the tape ended, I stared at the recorder for a long time. I felt angry that my husband had left without explaining this properly, but sad at the same time. I headed straight to the County Administrative Center's Social Services office. I met with Daniel and showed him the paper scrap and the recording. I don't think I can just send these kids out on the street. Daniel examined the materials, then began explaining county land records and the validity of wills. Right then, my phone buzzed. A text from Emily. Heard there are strange kids around your house. Be careful. The house needs to be kept clear. The phone felt cold in my hand. My daughter wasn't worried about me, she was worried about the house and land. Daniel asked, "Do you really want to help these children?" I nodded. Yes. This feels like something I need to do. Daniel smiled and began explaining the necessary paperwork and procedures. As I took notes, I made a promise to myself. That day, I made the biggest decision of my life. A few days later, Uncle Mark showed up. After being summoned by County Social Services, he walked into the administrative center office in dirty work clothes, glanced at the twins sitting beside me, and smiled awkwardly. I just asked them to watch the kids for a bit. It's no big deal. His voice came out light, but his eyes looked worried. Daniel spread documents on the table. When he mentioned the paper from the dog collar and the recording, Mark's expression hardened. His hands trembled on the table, and his voice dropped. That's something my brother left, but... He couldn't finish the sentence. Daniel showed us the records from the county registrar's office. The small piece of land where my house stood was originally registered in the twins' grandfather's name and had later been transferred to my husband due to debt issues. Looking at those records confirmed that what my husband had said was real. Mark sighed and confessed. When his brother was about to lose his house and land due to business failure, my husband had paid off the debt and temporarily took over the title. His brother had planned to save money and reclaim it, but died in an accident. Mark's voice got quieter and quieter, then he hung his head. He talked about his own struggles. Unpaid construction bills and credit card debt. I did it to survive. I thought if I sold the land and cleared the debts, I could get the kids settled somewhere stable. When he finished, the office fell quiet. I looked straight at him and said, "I've heard people say they did things to survive my whole life. But people still have to keep their promises and live with integrity." Mark insisted on taking the children back to his house. But the taller child shook their head and hid behind me, while the smaller one said through tears, "I don't want to go back there. Uncle's house is scary." Mark's face twisted at that moment. Daniel explained that minor protection and property rights were separate issues. He proposed keeping the children at my house temporarily under foster care, while the county processed official guardianship paperwork. I steadied myself and said, "At least in this house, they'll never have to ask if they can sleep in the doghouse again." I signed the temporary guardian documents. My hand holding the pen trembled, but my heart was steady. Mark left the office without a word, and the children held my hand tightly, feeling the warmth of their small hands. I told myself I'd made the right choice. On the way out of the administrative center, I saw a sign in the real estate office window across the street. Highway Expansion Redevelopment Zone, Investment Opportunity. The address on the map matched my neighborhood exactly. My heart dropped heavily. Now I clearly understood why my daughter kept telling me to clear out the house. That day, I realized my uncle wasn't the only person I'd have to fight. A few days later, unfamiliar cars pulled up on the road in front of my house. An SUV and a pickup truck stopped, their occupants looking over my yard beyond the fence and writing in notepads. I watched from the kitchen window. "This land's value will jump soon," a man's voice carried on the wind. In the afternoon, a man pretending to check the water meter entered the yard. I stood on the porch with my arms crossed, watching him. He made a show of examining the meter while actually surveying the house structure and yard size. He called someone else and said, "The old lady's going to a nursing home soon. They say her daughter's looking at realtors to clear the place out." My face hardened. That afternoon, Emily drove down from Seattle. I heard the car door open and my daughter step out. The sound of heels clicking on the gravel path toward the porch. Emily walked in and her expression stiffened the moment she saw the twins in the living room. "Mom, why did you bring these kids here? This is an important time." Her voice was sharp. Emily continued, "The road expansion is starting soon. The house needs to be cleared out. Mom living here alone isn't sustainable anymore." That's when I finally understood the reason my daughter had been calling so often lately. Asking about my health wasn't concern for me, it was concern about the house and land value. A cold feeling settled in my chest. By evening, what amounted to a family meeting convened in the living room. Emily sat on the sofa and said, "Mom's house is obviously mine. And those kids need to go back with their uncle." Mark stood by the door and agreed. "Just hand over the kids and we'll settle everything quietly." Their voices filled the room. I walked to the bedroom and opened the drawer. I pulled out a large envelope of documents and set it firmly on the living room table. Inside were the will fragment from the dog collar, a transcription of the recording, and a copy of the county land registry. Emily and Mark looked at me with shocked expressions. I began speaking in a steady voice. "Do you know whose land this originally was? Have you ever heard what promise your father made? And do you know why I've been silent all this time?" I laid out the documents one by one, revealing the truth. Emily shook her head at first. I placed the recorder on the table and pressed play. After the harsh static, my husband's voice came through. "Holding my brother-in-law's land in trust, someday. It has to be returned to the kids." Emily was speechless, and Mark hung his head while his hands trembled. My daughter's face went pale when she saw the unfamiliar name on the land registry. I said firmly, "I decide who gets this house. You couldn't even protect what your parents gave you, but these kids kept their grandfather's land safe. Even hidden in a dog collar." Emily opened her mouth then closed it, and Mark stared at the wall. I felt both satisfaction and sadness. I pulled out the new will and guardianship papers I'd prepared with Daniel. "From now on, we're doing this by law, not emotions." Emily and Mark could only stare at each other, seeing my firmness for the first time. The twins stood behind me, watching quietly, and I could feel their small breaths at my back. That night, I struck back in the most satisfying way of my life. Night fell deeper, and heavy silence filled the living room. The smaller child leaned against the dog, rubbing their eyes, while the taller one stared wordlessly at the papers on the table. Outside, wind rustled the branches. I sat down next to the taller child. Quietly, I asked, "Have you ever thought about why your grandfather hid that paper inside the dog collar?" The child looked up at me and slowly began to speak, sharing stories overheard at their uncle's house, when their grandfather was scammed and nearly lost the house and land. My husband had paid off the debt and taken over the title. Their grandfather had planned to save money and reclaim it, but died in an accident. The child's voice trembled, and the smaller sibling squeezed their hand. Mark finally opened his eyes and confessed. In the hospital before his brother died, he'd asked Mark to make sure the land went back to the children when they grew up. But drowning in debt, Mark had turned away from that promise. His voice shook and his shoulders sagged. He talked about the hard days, trying to feed his niece and nephew while bouncing between construction sites. Days when he couldn't get paid and had no money for food, days when debt collectors called 10 times, days when he left the house avoiding the children's eyes. I kept trying to survive, and that's how I became this cowardly. When he finished, his shoulders trembled. Emily began speaking quietly too. Memories of struggling through poor apartments with her mother as a child were so painful that, whenever money and houses came up, anxiety and greed hit her first. She'd thought that not wanting to burden her mother meant securing at least the house. My daughter's eyes reddened. I shared my own story too. The loneliness of keeping the house alone after my husband died, wanting to lean on my daughter, but never asking for help because I feared becoming a burden. I remembered nights sitting in the empty living room, playing my husband's recording and talking to myself. Listening to the adults' stories, the children began to understand gradually. They realized that adults weren't perfect heroes or complete villains. The taller child looked directly at their uncle for the first time, and the smaller one held my hand tight. I said clearly, "Circumstances are one thing, but wrongs must be answered for." Still, because you held onto that collar, the truth came out. I squeezed the twins' hands, sharing warmth. The children nodded slightly. After everyone went to bed exhausted, I sat alone in my bedroom and played my husband's recording again. Under a small light, I stroked the recorder and whispered, "Honey, I think we're finally keeping that promise together." When I closed my eyes, tears ran down my cheeks, and I quietly wiped them away. That night, we each faced our own truths. A few days later, Daniel, the twins, and I sat in the county courthouse service office. The clerk reviewed documents, beginning a consultation about guardianship designation and will execution. Through the window, I could see the courthouse parking lot and hear people coming and going faintly. The clerk carefully examined the will fragment from the dog collar and the recording file. There are technical issues with the format, but these could serve as important evidence supporting the deceased's wishes. Additional witness statements and county registry records would make it more solid, she added. I nodded and took notes. Daniel made a proposal considering the children's school and living situation. He suggested making me the primary guardian, Mark, a limited financial guardian with regular county monitoring. That way the children could attend school stably, while their uncle maintained minimal responsibility. A few days later, Mark met me in the courthouse hallway. He hesitated, then finally signed. In exchange for giving up rights to the redevelopment compensation, he'd get partial debt relief while maintaining some guardian role. His hand shook holding the pen, but the signature was firm. Emily sat with me alone on a hallway bench. After a moment of silence, my daughter said quietly, "Mom, do whatever you want with the house. Just don't hide it if you're sick." Her voice trembled, and I held her hand. "You live your life, but call these kids sometimes, like an aunt would." At the county social services office, complex. Paperwork continued for property transfer and guardian registration. Daniel explained each document, pointing where to sign. Getting everything documented like this will prevent future fights. He reassured me. I let out a relieved breath. I also attended a will workshop at the senior center. Sitting with other elderly people, listening to a lawyer's explanation, I drafted a new notarized will, leaving my remaining savings and part of the house to the twins. My hand holding the pen trembled, but my heart felt at peace. As legal procedures fell into place, the children's daily lives stabilized too. The taller child returned to the nearby middle school, and the smaller one enrolled in the community center's soccer program. Watching them take the town bus to school every morning made me smile. The day I signed the final documents, I sat on a bench outside the courthouse, looking at Main Street in the distance and cars flowing past. I murmured to myself, I think this house has finally found its rightful owners. Wind blew through my hair, and I closed my eyes to feel it. That day, we found our place within the framework of law. On a spring day with rain falling, the sound of water dripping from the doghouse eaves filled the yard again. It was a scene like the night the twins first arrived. I stood on the porch holding my coffee cup, watching Buddy and the twins' dog circle around the doghouse together. I remembered the trembling voices of the children, asking if they could sleep in the doghouse. What if I hadn't opened the door that night? What if I'd ignored that metallic clinking from the dog collar? I smiled. That one small sound had changed everything. Next to the doghouse now sat a small bench and flower pot. The smaller child sat there doing homework, occasionally touching that old collar. The collar wasn't used anymore, but the children kept it carefully, like a final gift from their grandfather. In the kitchen, the taller child was making pancakes. "Grandma, let's have Daniel over for dinner tonight. He did so much paperwork because of us." The voice was bright, and I nodded. Yes, we should thank him properly. I looked at the small speaker where my husband's recorder sat. Someday when the children were a bit older, I'd play the recording with them and tell the whole story about what promise their grandfather and my husband had made, and how precious that promise was. The smaller child fitted a new sturdy leash on the dog, then held the old collar in hand, staring at it. This collar changed our whole lives. Hearing the child's quiet voice, I smiled and answered, yes, there was a reason that metallic sound stuck in my ear. I remembered standing at the door that first night, pausing at that sound. In the evening, Daniel arrived. He handed me a will information booklet from the senior center. These days many seniors organize their wishes ahead of time. I took the booklet and replied, I've done what I needed to, but work on changing the system so these kids won't face injustice again. Daniel smiled and nodded. As night fell and the three of us sat together in the living room, the taller child asked carefully, "Are you really okay? What if Aunt and Uncle feel hurt?" My throat tightened, but I answered firmly yet warmly, "It's okay. People don't become family through blood. They become family by holding each other's hands to the end. The children nodded quietly. The smaller one held my hand tight, and the taller one wiped away tears while smiling. My own eyes grew hot, but I held back. Instead, I stroked the children's hair, feeling that, from now on, the three of us were together. Before turning off the lights, I looked one last time toward the doghouse window. Through the rain, I seemed to hear the children's trembling voices from that night again. "Ma'am, can we sleep in the doghouse just for tonight?" I fully realized now how much those words had changed my life. I repeated to myself, opening that door didn't just save those kids. It saved my remaining years too. I could hear the children talking quietly in the living room, and the two dogs dozing peacefully under the doghouse, their breathing soft. Outside, the rain gradually lessened. The sound of water dripping from the doghouse roof faded slowly. I quietly closed the window and walked back to my bedroom with a smile. The children's laughter lingered like an echo, and the house was filled with warm peace. That night, I understood. Family isn't made by blood, but by heart. Everyone, have you ever carried lonely, unfair times in your heart? Like I have? Through what happened today, I learned that what we must protect before blood ties are our hearts and our promises. Even if we realize it late, it is still all right. I believe we always have the courage and hope to choose again. If any similar experience or quiet story in your heart comes to mind, please feel free to share it in the comments so we can be a comfort to one another. If my story stayed with you, I would be grateful if you could support this channel with a subscription and a like. And if a family member or friend comes to mind, please gently share this video with them so it can bring a small light to their later years as well. Thank you sincerely for staying with me to the end, and I wish you long-lasting health and peace.